Good evening,
Hello,
everybody.
Maggie.
Good evening,
Hello, Sarah.
everybody. Please put yourself in mute, on the mute. Please put yourself on mute, otherwise we will have an echo. Especially those of you who are on iPhones or phones, you really need to be on mute. Okay.
Trying.
Oh, merci, Edwin.
Hi,
So yes, so we will start in a couple of minutes. Time for more people to come in. We have 50% now. Maybe there will be some people coming in late. I just want to make sure everybody's in. And in a few minutes, I will, let me see. Yep. We have two more people who are joining in right now. Okay, I can see a few familiar faces. I'm saying hi to my students, actually. And to people coming from as far away as North or South Carolina. Thank you, Jennifer.
Hi, Sarah. Sorry,
Hi.
I'm not ready for prime time right now. I just got back from another trip, and anyway, next time I'll have the courage to have the video on.
That's okay, Jennifer. We won't hold it against you.
Thank you. Merci.
Yeah. Okay. So, welcome, bienvenue for those of you who are new. Where is an event? I am the executive director of the Alliance Française. We have tonight with us the board president, Mr. Edwin Paxson. And we also have here a former board president, Mrs. Annie Says, who's here also tonight. I have also with me Catherine Philippe, who's the cultural programs coordinator. And of course, I have Maggie Paxson that you all come here to hear and listen to. I just wanted to let you know, first of all, to give a little bit of time for the people coming in late still. We have two more events, one next week, which will also be online for those of you who would like to join from afar. It will be at 6 p.m. on Thursday, the 24th of April, directly live from Toulouse, France, my hometown, as the Alliance Française of Washington, D.C. is preparing a trip in the fall to Toulouse from the 19th to the 27th of October. So it will be midnight in Toulouse and 6 p.m. in Washington, D.C. You can still sign up online for this event that will be online. And then in May, we have a very big event. We have an annual fundraising event, annual benefit event, which takes a lot of importance this year because it marks the 120th anniversary of the existence of an Alliance Française in the nation's capital. And we like to say about us that we are the French heartbeat in a nation's capital, which after all was designed by a French urbanist. So tickets are on for sale. I hope you will be able to support us. It's at the Residence of France on Tuesday, May the 13th. It's from 6:30 p.m. until 9:30 p.m. There will be a jazz live trio. There will be a swag bag. There will be a special dessert prepared by Pastry Poupon, who's quite famous here in Georgetown, for those of you who don't know it. So I hope you will join us for this special anniversary on the 13th of May. Please make sure you do remain on mute. There will be a chance after the conversation between Maggie and I, there will be a chance for you all to ask questions, but you can already also enter them in the chat. Catherine and I will actually filter them at the end, and if you don't want to speak, we can ask them for you as well. So you can use the chat, which is at the bottom. Also, I wanted to let you know that this event is recorded. So if you don't want to appear on the video, it's a time to switch off the video because the event is recorded. We will upload it on our YouTube channels for other people to actually benefit from the event as well, as it is an important event. What I want to say now is I'll quickly and very briefly introduce Maggie Paxson. She's a writer, she's an anthropologist and a performer, as if you have read the book, you've discovered just like I have. And in particular, I discovered that she sang with an orchestra that I know very well. So that was impressive for me. She is fluent in French. She is also fluent in Russian, and she is the author of Solovyovo, The Story of Memory in a Russian Village. And her essays have appeared in the Washington Post, the Post magazine, and the Eon, and elsewhere as well. I see that some more people are coming in as we speak. Today she will be speaking in English, and then when she comes back in May, on the 16th of May, just a couple of days after our benefit event on the Friday, May the 16th, she will be performing songs of the interwar and war period. And this event of tonight, together with the performance in May, makes the commemoration of the end of World War II for Alliance Française, Washington, D.C., because the war ended on the Western Front on May 8th, on the Eastern Front on May 9th, and in the Pacific Ocean in August 1945. So this is an important year, not only for the Alliance Française, but to mark the end of World War II as well. And without further ado, I will ask Maggie my first question. And what made you decide to become an anthropologist? Are there any specific difficulties for a woman to be an anthropologist? I mean, I studied political anthropology at the Political Science Institute in France, but I had my idea of Claude Lévi-Strauss or Margaret Mead in terms of anthropologists. So is there any glass ceiling to break for a woman? What made you decide to become an anthropologist?
Well, that is, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Catherine, for putting this together. And thank you so much for coming, everyone. I can't see all of your faces, but among your faces, I can see people who I haven't seen in a long time. People are very dear to me. So thank you all. And to those who I can't see. It's a while ago that I decided to be an anthropologist, but I think the truth is, when I was a young person, there was a part of me that was really driven by by the arts, really. I have a lot of artists in my family on the one side. And on the other side, I had this sort of scientific urge to understand the world. And I think the truth is, when I was going to college, when I went to McGill University in Canada, I had to make a decision that was sort of impossible for me to decide, because I wanted to do everything. The world was a wonder for me and amazing to me. And I think what happened with anthropology is that as I was sort of struggling my way through the course book, I saw this course that was called Symbol Systems and Ideologies. And it was a discussion about basically that the world, what it meant to me at my 18 years old was that the world was charged full of meaning everywhere. And anthropology was kind of a route into seeing how the world was full of meaning. I mean, it was maybe an immature view at first, but I actually still sort of believe that. And it proved to be something that was very true to my longing, my own desire, my longing. So I got a bachelor's degree in anthropology, and then that same impulse led me to do a master's and then a Ph.D. in anthropology at University de Montreal, on the other side of Montreal in Montreal. It's a very funny field. It's a field where basically your job is to go, at least back then, to go very, very, very far away and try to learn everything with your mind and your heart and your senses. It was a place where if you wanted to do intellectual discovery, you had a great deal of adventure and independence. And I was really attracted to that also. So as a woman, is there a glass ceiling? As you know, anthropology was in part, in the American version of anthropology, it was women were very, very important in the creation of cultural anthropology. So Franz Boas might have been the father figure to cultural anthropology, as you were mentioning his name, but there was Margaret Mead, and there was Ruth Benedict, and there was Zora Neale Hurston, and there were Ella Deloria. There were all these women around, and Franz Boas, this father of this American version of anthropology, gave sort of all this encouragement and all this environment of nurturing for all these women. So it's less kind of for social science. There is more, room for women to be part of there. Even back when I was a student, there was more room for women. Still, it's a little funny to go out in the world and think you are Indiana Jones and realize that when you're among the people who don't know you and you're learning a language, that you're vulnerable. You frankly are vulnerable in certain ways that in my experience became important. And there was no discussion of that at all when I was a graduate student. But, among the students we started talking about, it was really quite common for women in particular to be in physical danger doing this. So thankfully, there was plenty of intellectual space for women, but I think that, in the world that it was before, also we couldn't take cell phones to these places. We were alone, we were having this encounter with these other worlds alone, which was marvelous, but also non-trivially dangerous.
So yes, you do present yourself right away from the start of the book as an anthropologist. However, at the end, I was feeling a little bit concerned because at the end you say, and I quote, you call yourself a lapsed anthropologist. And in general, we have lapsed Catholic, lapsed, this and that. And I thought, wow, that feels a bit like leaving some kind of church of anthropology. So what was the case?
That's a great way of putting it. I really, for those who have or who will or who might read this book, they will see that it is like in a way, a record of a search. Like I'm a seeker, and it's the record of that seeking. And indeed, in fact, I think that phrase, lapsed anthropologist, was playing with this idea that that in some ways science has these rules of engagement, right? These specific rules of engagement that are quite narrow in some ways. And in that way, it behaves almost like a religion of its own, its own dogma, its own way of asking things, its own, restrictions. And so for me, I still do sometimes call myself a lapsed anthropologist because I wanted to bust out of those restrictions. I wanted to be able to ask the biggest questions that I could come up with. At the same time, and my husband, who's also a trained social scientist, he will call me on this. You don't unbecome an anthropologist. It stays with you. The training that I got to be able to go out and have this adventure in the world and try to learn these new places and see these new things in their own terms, that training never goes away. The profound humility in the sense of this field of anthropology, where your job is to listen, right? It's to be able to really try to understand the world in other people's terms. That kind of humility and humbleness stays with you. So I'm not, and actually the idea that there are things to understand, that you can understand, that science can help you understand, that never goes away and never will go away. But in effect, the religion of the framing of certain kinds of questions, yes, I was lapsed.
So the book, I'm showing it to you. I don't know if you can see very well. Probably you can see better on Maggie's screen. It's The Plateau. And I got it actually in 2019 when it was released, okay? And so I read it in 2019. I reread it to prepare this conversation. And it's interesting because sometimes in between there was COVID, and so it's almost like my mind went blank. But because what had marked me the most is a specific story, and we will go back to that story. But what I wanted to ask you, and by the way, it exists also in audible version. Okay, for those of you who prefer to listen to books, I can't, because if I put a book, an audible version, I'll fall asleep. So I really want to be able to read the book myself. And it also exists in French, and I will ask a question about the French title by the end. But it was translated. But what I want to know is, how did you choose to write about the Plateau du Vivarais-Lignon? Because if there is one region in France that is sort of isolated, it's that one. And really people born there, or born rather in the south, who have had historical links with the region for the history that your book talks about, know about the region, but not so much the rest of France, as a matter. So what made you choose that region?
Well, I think we're going to get a little bit into the origins of my connection with this story later. But my PhD in anthropology was about, I basically did a long field work. I had a long fieldwork experience in a little tiny village in Russia. And that's relevant here because in that experience, I was learning the question that I had for my dissertation. It was about what they called social memory. So how communities remember things together, how a community, not just an individual remembering the past, but communities, how they recall the past and reproduce the past in some ways into the present life. So I did this PhD, I did this very intense research in a place that for me was very far away and very different from the world that I knew, and that I grew up in. The gist of what I learned from that research was that small communities that are very distant from the center of authority in their country still can have a great deal of power. So even when very powerful states, for example, would wish those communities to change in fundamental ways how they live, how these Russian villagers, the Soviet state and then the new Russian state really wanted to push people to live in very different ways from how they had lived. And sometimes they used violence for it, and sometimes they used all kinds of methods. Those communities were able to kind of hold tight and not do what the state wanted to, which is fascinating. It's really interesting because we're used to thinking about states and their power, and they have a great deal of power, including the power of violence. But even that, in the research that I did, taught me that this very small community of people still wanted to live in important ways in their own terms. So when I came across the story years later, well, it kind of mixes and meshes, of the Plateau Vivarais-Lignon. This little plateau is a story of a little plateau in France, isolated, far from the state, right? That had an experience when there was an occupation of another country into France, that desired that community to change in very important ways, right? So it was parallel to what I learned in Russia. The context in some ways was parallel. The overarching new state was pushing the community to be in a certain way during the Second World War. They were resisting. So when I came across the story of Le Chambon in a more deep way, I thought, here is a place where people are resisting a state. They are rural people. They are farmers. I know about farmers. I know about rural people. I know about people who look powerless and humble, who still have power. So when I came to the story, and I think, as I said, I think we're going to get into the details a little bit, but it was parallel to my anthropology work in Russia in a way. And I was like, I know how to look at that story. I have a past where I've looked at stories similar to that, and I can do that here. And I have a good reason to, because I want to know what that community is like, because they did something that I want to understand.
Mm. And so, of course, in that community, in the Vivarais-Lignon, what interested me when I read the book in 2019 is the connection with the Trocmé family and Pasteur Trocmé in particular, because that is really the Vivarais-Lignon is also, for those of you who haven't been to that region in France, it's really like a hotbed of Protestantism. At the time in the it was really, there were a lot of Protestants living there, and Pastor Trocmé was part and was the head of la Résistance protestante française, the French Protestant resistance. That, is hardly ever mentioned because everybody knows about the FTP and the FFI and, La France Libre, De Gaulle and les francs-tireurs partisans, but hardly anyone will have heard of either Cardinal Saliège, who was in Toulouse for the Catholic resistance, or Pastor Trocmé for the French Protestant resistance. So you discover, and the reader discovers with you, that it's not only just Pastor André Trocmé and Magda, his wife, it's also Daniel Trocmé, so who is the hero in a way of the book. Even though it's a non-fiction book, he is the hero, and one wants to know from the start to the end what happens to Daniel. So how did you discover Daniel Trocmé?
So it was a process that took a number of years, really, and a lot of effort. I have a family connection to Daniel Trocmé. That's how it happened. When I was a little girl, my great-grandfather had a beautiful wife named Suzanne. And that beautiful wife was French. This was not my great-grandmother. I never knew my great-grandmother. And we would go to my grandmother's house for holidays, and there would be this sweet, smart, lovely woman named Suzanne Trucmé. I remember my mother telling me that Suzanne's family was somehow involved in the French resistance. And I thought this was a very romantic thing, that I had this French, this French woman in my life, in my family, who was in the French resistance. So Suzanne's last name was Trucmé. So many years later, I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I was visiting there with a very dear friend whose family, whose mother actually had escaped the Holocaust. I was visiting for the first time. And in the Holocaust, if many of you have been there, there is a floor that is dedicated to rescue and resistance. And it was really kind of a remarkable moment for me, because that's after you get to that floor, after you've been through all of the horrors on the other floors. I don't have to tell you all what you see, all that you learn about what was happening in the camps and before the camps, and the Holocaust by bullets, and you're learning, and the shoes and the photographs, and you're learning all. You arrive on this floor called Rescue and Resistance, and there is an exhibit to Le Chambon sur Lignon on that floor. Somehow vaguely I understood that maybe this Trucmé, Suzanne Trucmé, maybe her life was somehow related to that story. I remember I turned and I went to that exhibit, and there I saw the name Trucmé right in that exhibit. And I read about Trucmé. So I knew there was a Suzanne Trucmé who is a lovely, lovely woman. I knew that there was now more and more André Trucmé, Magda Trucmé. I knew that. But, getting back to anthropology, I remember there at the Holocaust Museum, when I went years later, a second time, I said to myself, this is an amazing story. I'm an anthropologist, as what I was saying earlier. I know how to study communities that resist powerful forces to do things. This is a beautiful story because they resisted the force of the Nazis, right? So this is a story. I was like, I can do this like an anthropologist. I can go to that community now, and I can see if there's anybody that knows anything about that. Really what it was that if the community has reproduced any of these habits that they had back then now. That's what I wanted to know. But with Trucmé, I was a little embarrassed, honestly, because I was like, I didn't want to go into this story thinking I had some relative that did, and I had no idea how Suzanne was related. But in time, after I was determined to go for the first time to Le Chambon sur Lignon, I started digging. I started digging into the family, who was who. I figured out in a footnote somewhere, I think, in one of the early books, that there was Suzanne, like there was the names of the families. And I learned that this Daniel, this young Daniel, who is also part of the story, was Suzanne's beloved baby brother, her younger brother. They were very, very close as children. So who is Daniel and what did he do? Daniel is the young cousin of André Trucmé. André was the pastor. He was a young man. He was in his 30s when the war began. He had been through a lot in his life of seeking. He was a young seeker. He was studying philosophy. He had gone to École des Roches, which for those of the French people among our audience know that this is one of the prominent, important high schools, lycée, collège in France. His father and mother were his father was a director. He had this very kind of special education in that way. But everything inside of him was rebelling against that. And he started wanting to learn the world for himself, not so religious, not so restricted, not so bourgeois. So he started traveling in the 1930s. He worked in Beirut. In Beirut, he met all these people of all these religions from all over the world. He started understanding. He wrote letters home that said to his parents, I see that there are things that are good and beautiful about Christianity. His parents were religious, quite religious, but also what is ugly and false. He said that. And he also wrote them another letter that said, I see that there is not one civilization, but civilizations. So this was not the right, his parents were concerned because this was sounding a little kind of wrong. Yeah, wild and wrong. And again, he's in the world where people are talking, he's meeting all kinds of people from all religions, and he's traveling and he's encountering poets, and he's exhilarated by this, and they're worried by this. And then the war begins, and the École des Roches, where his father was a director, has to close in the north. It opens a version in the south. He starts teaching there. He'd been teaching in much more glamorous places for himself. He did not like it. He was not happy. And then he gets a letter from Pastor André Trocmy that says, come and help. Come and help. Can you come and help to Le Chambon? We're having this incredible effort. And he weighs that decision. This is in 1942, August of 1942. He has a choice of finishing his doctorate. He wants to get his doctorat. He wants to finish his doctorate. He wants to go to Barcelona. He has a job offer in Barcelona. He has a girlfriend. He weighs all these things. And then he has this offer, earning no money, just going to help in this effort in Le Chambon with some children, refugees. And he thinks about it for a little while. Then he writes his mother a letter, and he says, the die is cast. I'm going to go to Le Chambon. And I'm going to go there, and it's going to be an adventure. But I'm not going because it's an adventure. He said, I'm going because I want to be part of the reconstruction of the world. And then he said, I'm also going because in the end, I do not want to be ashamed of myself. So this young man decides to go. I don't know how he read the sky, I don't know how he read the clouds. I don't know how he read the moment when so many people were having such trouble reading that moment all over the world, really understanding the gravity of the moment that they were living, but he did. So I learned this about Daniel, and I went to Le Chambon for the first time. And I plan to go for about a week to see can I write about this place. But I have in my journal a note that I wrote to myself, and I wrote, searching for Daniel. So at the same time, I didn't want to talk about it. I thought, you're a social scientist. You're not supposed, nobody cares about your family. You can learn about Daniel on your own. It doesn't matter. You're not a historian. I'm not a historian. You're not writing a biography of this young man. Don't put this at the center of things, but I fell in love with this young man and his story. It is a beautiful, beautiful story of a young seeker who found himself in a moment when it was very hard to find yourself. A lot of people were very, very confused, but he found himself, and he was happy in Le Chambon in ways that he had never been happy before. So readers will learn, and maybe we'll talk about it, what happened to him in that happiness. But that's the thing. It went from being, I went from being a pretty, honestly, an anthropologist coming in with some certainty to seeing then the story and this young man and thinking, it's like he went there and I could follow him, not as a social scientist, but as a person, as a soul who went there with his own seeking. So yes, he is the hero of this story, even though it's not a novel. He is the hero, and from the beginning to the end, the fate of this young man and what I could learn from him in this story is really at the center of it.
Mm-hmm. So you did mention it's not a fiction, it's not a story, it's the real stuff. However, it's not a biography, and you've just said that as well. But that is interesting because you wove your story and your work as an anthropologist together with Daniel's story and that of the Plateau then and today. So how did you choose, and why did you choose that kind of narrative structure rather than a biography, for instance?
I would never recommend choosing that structure for other writers because it was very complex in the end. I will say that as a writer, for me, form follows function. So I did not choose to write. First of all, I never wanted to write about myself. I never had the intention to write a book where I would myself as a character, because you're a character, you're yourself.
You're pretty much a lot in it, yes.
And I never intended to do that. And I think there were a number of things that were happening, one of which was that the questions themselves were feeling more and more urgent with everything that I learned. Meaning, let's say I began with a question about what did this community know about how to shelter and protect outsiders, even in dangerous times? What did they know about how to be good when it's hard to be good? But more and more, the longer I was looking at this question, this is a hard subject to write a book about, the Holocaust, right?
Yes.
I have Jewish family. I mean, even if I didn't have Jewish, it's a hard subject to write a book about. And you start taking everything really rather personally. Not meaning like this is a wound and I'm the victim in this story, but what would I do if it were me? What if it was me in that moment? Can I condemn people who did the wrong thing in a moment? How do I understand what they did? How do I understand what people did the right thing? Are they angels and the people who did bad things devils? Is that the right way to think about it? That only angels can do the right thing and only demons can do the bad thing? No, we're all this mixture of being able to turn one way or another way. And so I thought what the reason why, and it was hard for me to write about myself. I have to say that was a really hard thing. My editor actually encouraged me more and more in that direction because she was like curious. She was wanting to know what was going on with this story. But I took these questions very much to heart. And to be honest, I thought, I want the reader to take these questions to heart for themselves. And how can I ask the reader to ask these questions to themselves in a hard way, in a serious way, if I'm not willing to do it myself? So I bring myself in there. I'm a very private person in a lot of ways. It's hard to believe I'm a performer and a singer, but that's not the same thing. Still, I would not have chosen to share like a lot of these questions, but I think, how could I ask a reader to say, what if it was me? What if it was that? What if I were there? Would I have done the right thing, or if I wasn't willing to ask myself those questions? So it's a narrative form. I should say it was very hard, but it was also exhilarating because it allowed me really to write a book that in some ways I think of as, almost has a poetic like structure to it. And so I got to write the book of my dreams also with it. I got to write with all the lyricism that I wanted to. And I also got to pull the story into the present day, as you were mentioning, because not long after going to Le Chambon for the first time, I learned that there were all these refugees from all over the world living there now, and meaning now, the now of the book, but the now of the now also, right now, today, as we speak. And I thought that was really important. It started being really, really important in my own story because, again, not as a historian, I did not come to write another history, but what I did come to do is see this community in action, in a way, in action now, and how they behave now, and how they treat vulnerable people now. So.
Yeah, and it's one of the questions you ask on page 55. You ask if it's being born on the plateau that makes you a good person, whether it's the region. So that was, I thought, such an intriguing question myself. But let's go to the survivors. How many survivors or children were rescued by either Danielle Trocmé or André and Magda Trocmé? How many of them did you interview and meet?
So but it's been a long time. There are not very many people left. So I was able to talk to some locals, right? Including people who had been involved in the resistance, people who had sheltered people who had people in their homes. But a lot of the children themselves, not all, but a lot of the children have moved on wherever they are. What we do have is a lot of testimony that exists. I will say, before getting into that, I had the great honor and the great privilege of spending wonderful time with one of the children who's really featured in the book, named Pierre Sauvage. I'm sorry, not Pierre Sauvage, who's the writer. I'm sorry, this is Peter Feigl. Pierre Sauvage did the marvelous movie called The Weapons of the Spirit, which everyone should watch. I got that name wrong, but everyone should watch that movie about Le Chambon. Peter Feigl, or he went by Pierre when he was there. Peter Feigl was a child. He's woven throughout the book. He was a remarkable child. He kept a diary while he was in Le Chambon. There's an incredible story about his diary. He also did interviews later. There's a book about children's diaries during the Holocaust by Alexandra Zapruder called Salvaged Pages. So where his diary is featured. So I've had the great privilege of spending time with him and doing events with him, including events where I, read a letter from Daniel Trocmé from concentration camp to the children that he had been taking care of in Le Chambon, and he was one of those children. So it was a letter directed to him, and then he has appeared to talk to the audience after that, which is really, really remarkable. He is an incredible soul. He survived, obviously, the war. He had his own remarkable adventures that began long before Le Chambon and went on long after. And he now has dedicated decades of his life to teaching what he learned, teaching children, school children, doing all kinds of events about what he learned from the people of Le Chambon. But the other thing I was going to say, though, is there's just a lot of remarkable testimony, people who have been interviewed, people who have shared their memoirs, and I drew on them as much as possible. I watched a lot of long interviews with people from the Shoah Foundation, people who are no longer alive, but they did these video interviews so you could see them talk about the place, and through collected testimonies. And they were amazing ones, so touching among them. So I felt very, very lucky. And they do exist. They exist in French mostly, but there are some that have been translated into English. But if you'd like, you had mentioned.
Yes, I would like actually for you to read an excerpt from page 143 to 147, which is for me actually as a double time reader of the book. I read it in 2019 and I reread it again to prepare for the conversation today. Was the most moving moments, probably, or one of the most moving moments in your book. But what I wanted to say, because I didn't know about what you just mentioned, but a few years back, I think it was 2013, I went to Maine, where my daughter was at university at the UMaine, and I took her to Rockland. There is a little cinema theater called The Strand, and that evening, and she was, can you believe it? She was like a 19-year-old, okay? She was really completely first year university. She was not very happy with herself at the time or whatever. And so I said, well, let's go to the cinema, because it was the Columbus Day in Indigenous People Day at the time now. And so we went to that cinema, The Strand. And there was a movie about this British man, Nicholas Winton, who had saved so many children, Jewish children from Czechoslovakia at the time, and brought them to England. And so we watched the movie, which, as you can imagine, is a documentary. It's full of interviews. It's already overwhelming as it is, etc. And that, this is the amazing thing with those little villages and little cities far from the power, is that there is a Q&A at the end of the projection. And lo and behold, a lady stands up and says, "I was one of those children who was saved by Nicholas Winton." And there my daughter just, burst into tears, and she was barely 19. So that was one. And so that's why I wanted you to read that excerpt as well, because it brought that back to me as well when I was reading it. So please do so.
Yeah, I will do that now. This sets us back in time a little bit in 1942. And so after the failed raid in August 1942, things got pretty quiet in the Plateau for months and months. Daniel, having settled in with his crickets, began falling in love with every little one of them. They played their games, sang their songs, read their books, rushed to be the first on the rope. By February, he had straightened out the mess in the organization of Les Grillons with the help of his cousin, André, and assumed more responsibility there. He'd made a reputation for himself in the village as friendly and warm and even chic. He could speak other languages and now began to feel truly useful. Finally, This worldly young man, full of questions, this backwoods cosmopolitan, was feeling like himself. Then, on February 13, 1943, André Trocmé was arrested. The Gestapo arrived at his door at the presbytery. Magda let the officers in and fed them all dinner. Yes, she did, as André gathered his things. Villagers gathered small gifts of food and toilet paper for his journey. Together with Pastor Théis and the head of the public school in Le Chambon, Roger d'Arcissac, André was sent to a supervised residence camp at Saint-Paul-des-Jeux, about 400 kilometers from the Plateau. From his own account, even with the discomforts of camp and the fear of what would follow, André enjoyed what he called a wonderful camaraderie with his fellow inmates, who were mostly communists and other political undesirables. He was even able to conduct a sermon there eventually, after a passage in Hebrews. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. A photograph of Trocmé and Théis from Saint-Paul-des-Jeux shows the two men sat in dimly lit room with books on a shelf behind them. Théis in a sweater, reading a book, Trocmé in a suit and tie, smiling a little and playing harmonica. Together with Roger Le Forestier, Daniel raced down to the departmental capital to plead for Trocmé, Théis, and d'Arcissac. It was a dangerous gambit and it didn't work. The three would be interned for an indefinite period. And as it turned out, as the mountain of documents with the mountains of typed names piled up one by one, and as the German plans for total war finally trickled south into occupied lands and then up against gravity into the highest plateaus, it was an important time for Trocmé and the others to be gone. Because on February 24th, 1943, at 7 o'clock in the evening, the company commandant of Haute-Loire received a list with the names of 82 foreign Jews in the region. 10 of those were living in Le Chambon. 3 raids were immediately set in motion that night, with motorcycle escorts and buses and men with long lists creeping into the dark. By 7 in the morning, the arrests had begun. The man in charge of the raid in Le Chambon was a young police inspector, 23 years of age, named Léopold Prély. Prély was already a known quantity in Le Chambon. With his affable manners, his ease, and even flirtatiousness with locals, his fashionably slicked back hair, and the fact that he was Protestant, he had insinuated himself into life in the Plateau. He'd been in charge of raids before, like the Big Flop in August 1942, for which he'd clearly caught heat. You see his name all over the documents from those months, his signature, a cipher. I've never actually seen the final list of the 82 or of the 10, so many lists, so many silver fish in the ocean. But one name that I know for sure was there was Jacob's. Jacob, who despite his frail frame had been known to go around the village saying out loud, "Vive le de Gaulle." This time when Prély saw Jacob, he said, "I finally got you." "I finally got you," said the 23-year-old policeman with his slick back hair and his way with the ladies to a still razor-thin boy, a boy whose parents, Arnold and Irma, had already left for Auschwitz on Convoy 17 from Drancy, a boy who, when he heard that news, cried and cried and cried. "I finally got you," said the special policeman who, with his list, had traveled against gravity up to the Plateau. Jacob got on the bus. Martin, his brother, got on the bus too, along with some 60 other people who had been rounded up in other parts of Haute-Loire. And they waited while the motorcycles came and went, while the arrestees all climbed up the creaky stairs of the bus in the cold. And then word went out into the village. A crowd gathered. There are several accounts of that day. The crowd surrounded the bus. The crowd began shouting. At a certain point, some villagers lay down in front of the bus, not permitting it to leave. One witness says that he heard from the crowd Daniel yelling, "I accuse this man of being responsible for this arrest," pointing at Léopold Prély. Does that sound like Daniel? I don't know. But all of the witnesses agree on two things that followed. First, a boy in the crowd dashed off. That boy, another refugee, a half-Jew from a prominent family, ran like crazy to his room at the home where he had been living in the center of Le Chambon. His mother, far away from him now, had given him a bar of chocolate, a gift that grew to romantic proportions in his mind, that someday this chocolate might save his life. The boy ran off into his room and without thinking, took the last 2 squares of his chocolate, put them in a little matchbox and ran back to the bus. Then he slid the matchbox into Jacob's hand. And all the witnesses agree on one thing more, that the crowd started to sing. To the tune of Auld Lang Syne, they began the well-known French scout song, Ce n'est qu'un au revoir. Must you leave us without hope of your return? Must you leave us without hope that we will see you again one day? It is but an au revoir, my brothers. Yes, we will see one another again, my brothers. It is but an au revoir. Finally, the police forced the villagers lying on the ground to get up, and the bus left, full of men and women and children who were now descending back down the hills, down into the madness of exile, back into the camps, back to Gurs and worse, Auschwitz, where they were destined to die. Was it then that some bell rang inside Daniel's heart? Did he hear it for the first time then? Did it ring for him as it rang for the boy with his chocolate, or for the villagers lying on the ground, staring at the great wheels of a bus that could, at any moment, crush them? As far as I can make out from the historical record, Daniel then got into a car with Dr. Le Forestier and raced down to police headquarters in Le Puy. The two of them then pleaded now for Jacob, who was not yet 18 and should not have been arrested with the others. They couldn't plead for everyone, but this life they could fight for. This life they could hope to return from the madness. And it worked. Which is how so many years later, in a room full of survivors, a man named Jack, who had once been a boy named Jacob, could tell the man sitting next to him the story about how he had been in Le Chambon and been arrested, and how the whole village gathered around the bus singing Ce n'est qu'un au revoir, and how one boy put chocolate into his hand. And as Jack told that story, the man next to him, now white-haired and handsome too, could himself begin to cry, saying, I was that boy.
It's just amazing how the circumstances made that Jacob meet again so many years later, that little boy that gave him the chocolate piece. It's just amazing, I feel. Yeah.
And I have to say that there were so many, for me, things that I got to witness in the writing of this book, these miracles, large and small. Sometimes it was a miracle that no one ever noticed before, like someone did a kind thing by not noticing that someone was there in a train, or reading their documents falsely, or letting them go. Those were miracles also. You know, most every survival during that war required a miracle. And they're not recorded for history, but they're there. They're there in the lives that were saved, and their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, and all of those lives. It's sometimes it boggles the mind to think of what one act that we do without even thinking, sometimes the ripple effect that it can have on the world. So.
Totally, and that's why my next question for you will be about Daniel, because Daniel gets arrested and sent to a concentration camp. But when he's questioned, when he's interviewed by the Gestapo and by the Nazi, he returned the logic of their questions against them as a method of denouncing, or is it actually, my question is more like, is it a method doing what it did? Like, you know, you protected a Jew. No, I protected a human being. Is it a method of actually denouncing fascism and right-wing, extreme racism and authoritarianism, what he did. I mean, I was very, very impressed with that.
Again, that I pieced together that story from the testimony of some of the young men who were in first Moulin, when that in case was Moulin prison with him, from this and that and that. And again, like you said, it's remarkable. The power and the presence that he had, the presence and the courage, right? Courage, not only just to meet the moment, but to meet the moment with an impeccable logic, right? Which is that I'm not here to love a person or hate a person for what their label is. I'm here to love a human being or protect a human being. I think that logic, there's something for me, with every chapter as the book goes on, I was learning more from him also. We're also, with every chapter, we're getting closer and closer to the greatest sacrifice that he makes, of course. But here it was, he was standing up for his deepest humanity and the deepest humanity of every single person that he crossed, even the humanity of the people who were questioning him. I don't hate you because you're German. I don't hate Germans. I don't hate you. You have the same humanity that child has that I was taking care of. It's a profound reflection of some, I mean, I don't know what inspired him in the moment. I don't think one can ever know what one would do in that moment, how one would find that courage, but it was a profound courage that he found and a profound truth that came from him, really about the acceptance of the oneness of humanity. Everybody is equally human and everyone is equally deserving of nobility. And he's doing that and saying these things as he's being smacked in the face, his glasses flying off. So I don't know, it's very, when you read these things too, it's just so incredible to contemplate. What if it was me? What if it was now? Daniel made it look easy. It wasn't easy, but something about, I think, I say in the book, I get into this, he really fell in love with the people he was taking care of in a very pure way. He had been a troubled in many ways youth, but he fell in love with the children in his care and the young people in his care. And I think that gave him this kind of strength. But yes, I absolutely feel that this is how you fight. You fight the forces of division by saying we're one. I'm not hating you because you're German. I'm not loving him in particular because he's Jewish. I love him because he's a human being. I love you because you're a human being. Not love, gushy love, but, the kind of, love, the real stuff, So it was an amazing moment. There are many moments, as I said, like that for me in reading these documents, the unbelievable things that emerged from those moments.
So earlier on, you did mention that Daniel had been, raised in École des Roches, which in fact was not a public school. That's why I wanted to comment upon. It was a private school, the Protestant, private school, because the people imagine France, being a Catholic country with Catholic schools, where private Catholic schools. But no, there are public schools, which are states. And then there are Catholic schools, which obviously are run by nuns and priests, but there are also a few, not that many, a few Protestant schools, as well as some Jewish schools nowadays. I actually taught in the one that was attacked in 2012 in Toulouse. I wasn't there anymore, but I had left the France in '95, but I taught for 10 years in that Jewish school in France, even though I'm not Jewish. And like Danielle, I have this first name. Everybody thinks that I could be Jewish, but I'm not. So there you go. And then there are, of course, now some Muslim schools as well. But he came from what we call in French the HSP. HSP is the French acronym for Haute Société Protestante, which means the Protestant upper class of France, which were more or less, like the bourgeois or aristocratic Catholic upper class in France. And the difference, though, was that there was a streak within the Protestant people, especially in that École des Roches, and then that other school, the Sevenol school, something that was inspired by the pacifist movements. One of the I would say, of course, everybody knows about Jean Jaurès, who got assassinated before World War I because by a nationalist, because he was a pacifist in 1914, just before the war started. But there were more pacifists as well, especially during the interwar period. And one of them was Romain Rolland, who was a French author who ended up in Switzerland at the end of the war, where he died before the end of the war. But in your book, you mentioned the Sevenol School, which is where, the petits grillons, les grillons are going to the Sevenol School, which had a really particular curriculum which went on, after the war to really promote pacifism and promote aimez-vous les uns les autres, love one another. So that was, page 80, you say that even one's enemies are creatures of God. And I thought that was important. And then, of course, the shock for the reader comes 100 pages later, around page 171 and 174, to find out about the abominable murder that took place of a 13-year-old girl, Agnès Marin, by a 17-year-old boy, Mathieu Mourin, in 2011. But your book doesn't mention anywhere that 3 years later, the Sevenol School closed in 2014. So why not mention that?
Well, thank you for that description of this extraordinary school that really was a child of the philosophies of nonviolence that predated the war, of course, that was founded in 1938. And I want to just say that one of the legacies of, that is treated in historical literature in a lot of depth is André Trocmé's nonviolent resistance, right? It's very, very important to who he was. And it's important, very important to the story. It isn't the whole story of Le Chambon. Of course, there were lots of different things going on in the war, but it's very important in his story. I was absolutely amazed by how he was reading Thoreau. He was reading Gandhi, that he'd come to the New York I'm going to say the wrong name because my brain isn't working, but he had come to the United States, Union Theological, to study nonviolent resistance. And so it was an amazing thing where you have this incredible force of the personality of André Trocmé and the force of this idea of nonviolent resistance, and also not an idea that everyone embraced, of course. And yes, the school did continue on, and I got to know people who had, studied there, and there's a whole American kind of alumni, and there were summer schools. But yes, this horrific murder took place while I was there. The readers will see that I spend time in the school. I've become very close to one of the teachers. We're still very close friends. In fact, I'm going to see her this summer. So getting used to what the school is like now, and the school opened its mandate away from simply talking about nonviolence, but also to include children who didn't have easy places to study elsewhere. So yes, one of the students at this marvelous school murdered another of these students, and it was a terrible, terrible thing. And it was something that I, as a thinker, as a writer, but mostly as a person, had to figure out how to understand. And it happens really halfway through the book in a way. It really is where the book has, actually, there are a bunch of structures that happen in the book, and that propels me into a new section, because I was like, I'm going to have to understand this. What does it mean to open the door when opening the door does that? Opening the door to people who are dangerous, in effect, when it does that. So the school did close. Yeah, I did not, and I do partly regret that I hadn't insisted a little bit more on this. The closure of the school per se is, I think, something that helps readers understand it. In the French edition, I deal with it, I think, appropriately in the preface to the book. I am able to write about how this happened and what it meant. So yes, I don't disagree with you that it might have had a good home in the English version as well. Also, as we were saying a little bit before we came on and welcomed everyone, in France, the story that murder was just as astonishing for all of France as it was for locals. I mean, I had a very dear friend. She's still my very dear friend. She said, we're not used to this. I said, it could have happened. And she said, we don't know the world. This is not something that happens. So yeah, it was terribly, terribly, terribly sad, but something that, like all things that surprise you in these ways and seem to ruin everything, it actually helped me ask deeper questions than I thought about the real stakes when you open the door, when you try to be good, when it's hard to be good, and when things still go badly, then what do you do? And so it allowed me to go deeper, I think, the story of the murder itself. At first I was like, what is this? But then I followed it along, and I think the story itself helped me, as I said, go to some important places. So
I've got a couple more questions before opening the floor to everyone. One of them is the fact that Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, at least for the French, is known as well as the place where Camus, the Nobel Prize for Literature, went to kind of cure his tuberculosis, because he had tuberculosis, okay, Albert Camus. Although he didn't die of it, he died in a car accident, but all his life he suffered from bad lungs. And of course, that's also the place, Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, where he really wrote sort of the first draft of the famous book, The Plague, La Peste. A lot of us read that during COVID again. So it has been said also that the place, Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, gave him inspiration, and that some of the names of the characters in the book, as well as some of the places in the book, may have come from his inspiration on the plateau. So that's your name. You actually talk about Camus in your book. However, your book does not only mention Camus, but also another author very important to you since your childhood. And like Camus, it's an author who's a star in France of humanistic literature and a war hero as well. And it's none other than Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And so what affinity do you personally have with those two authors? And I should say now that your book, the Plateau, in French is not translated as Le Plateau, not at all, but it's translated as On ne voit bien qu'avec le coeur, which is a very famous quote from Le Petit Prince, the Little Prince. So don't you fear, though, that because of all of the implication with this quote, which has been distorted a little bit by new age kind of thing, etc. Don't you feel like it might be misunderstood for something else when people see it in the shop, in a bookstore?
Well, okay, I'll start with the beginning. Thank you for these questions. Camus was, again, another really, like, how is it possible that he wrote that book there? How is that possible? And he did. Or much of it, he sketched it out. And at the same time, as I understand, his philosophy of the world, how do you deal with suffering? How do you deal with the meaning of it? How do you have a life full of love when there may or may not be anything guiding that life? I mean, there may or may not be a God. Like, he is such an extraordinary humanistic thinker that he was a wonderful partner for me to think with, that I got to think with him and wrestle through with some great suffering that was happening in Le Chambon at the moment, and with the people's lives of the present day refugees and in the past. So he gave me, it was like I got to have a conversation with him. And I think in some ways he was offering a model, and might not be I don't know that it was probably not the only model, but one model for how do you have a good life, a moral life, a life of meaning and humanism. How do you do that? How do you navigate through these crazy, crazy times? So that was wonderful. So Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. So that, of course, is The Little Prince. The Little Prince is really, he's part of the book. I did not intend for this to be the case either, but in a way, he's the little spirit from the very beginning of the book to actually almost the last page. I begin with the book. Actually, I'll read this quote because the inscription on the front, the first epigraph of the book is from Le Petit Prince. Il y avait sur une étoile, une planète, la mienne, la terre, un petit prince à consoler. So the book is framed with this idea that there's this person, this refugee, in effect, that needs to be consoled, right? I begin it with that. So my affection for the little prince is probably very similar to the affection that a lot of French people, or a lot of people, human beings, with the purity of his story, the purity of his seeking for love, the meaning of that love, the questions that we have about very large things through a very tender and yet true voice. And I was given the book by a teacher when I was 8 years old in the hospital for something. I treasured that book. I kept it with me, but I also realized what, in some ways, this hero, this small hero, Le Petit Prince, is a refugee in a way, who comes with gifts for us, who comes with wisdom for us, who dies, right? Who goes off into the stars and dies, right? He goes off. And of course, Saint-Exupéry is also living the war in an extraordinary, he dedicates Le Petit Prince to a friend of his, a Jewish friend of his, who was in a prison camp at the time, I believe, and who was hungry and who was sick, he says. So I thought that it was, so I secretly, and in my own little, I started finding he was coming up in the narrative here and there, and he comes in a number of times, Le Petit Prince. So my editor, I believe, I have her to thank for this. Sophie Bayard is her name, from Payot-Rivages. She came up with this title, I believe. And because I'm not French, although, you know, I spent a lot of time speaking French and living in the French world, all I knew was that it pointed in that direction of some of the deepest messages that I wanted to leave with the reader, these pure, wise, beautiful messages. So I didn't know, like, is that going to be okay? On ne voit bien qu'avec le cœur. One sees clearly only with the heart, right? That felt really right. I knew that a French reader would see that and it would be a thing to them. The English reader would never see that as the same. It would never make sense. I hoped that the French reader would be open-hearted and generous with that title, you know, and see it not as a cliche, but as, you know, something very earnest. So, I love that she named it that, because it felt there's something that felt very true in that title. But the French readers will have to weigh in on that. See, so
yeah, that's true. Well, as a woman of science, you're an anthropologist, so you're a woman of science, okay? Your book is surprisingly infused with many references to religion, yours from Judaism to the Baha'i faith, and of course the Trocmés, Protestantism. So my question to you will be, in the times we're living right now, where we seem so divided, with science on one hand, opposing religion on the other side, etc., can we reconcile science and religion?
yes, I think we can. How's that for an answer? I did not intend to write a lot about religion. I mean, in many ways, I'm an anthropologist of religion. I know how to study religion like an anthropologist. That comes out in the book, but I really wanted to be able to get to, as I said, questions that were, you know, not just what science is comfortable with, but with other questions that sometimes religion might handle, even if religion handles these questions very badly in some ways. Sometimes I think, you know, I write early on in the book, you know, what do I think about religion? Sometimes religion makes you better than you might have been without it. And sometimes maybe it makes you worse. Like, so religion per se is not a formula for being good. Sometimes it really can make you good. And sometimes it, you know, that's only questionable. Maybe it makes you worse. So actually, I think a good reflection though, maybe, and I think this is close to where we're wrapping up, but while I was writing The Plateau, my husband was writing a book also. My husband is a historian. Charles King is his name. And he's a political science. He's in a government department, but he writes history books. And the history book he was writing was about the history of American anthropology, including the history of Franz Boas, Margaret Mead, Zora Neale Hurston, Ruth Benedict, all these central figures. And so we would have lots and lots of, because I was sort of exhibit A. It was sort of fun because here he had an anthropologist right at home and we could talk about it a lot. And I was learning things about the history of my discipline through him. So this is to answer your question. At one point, it was 1911. It was 1911, a very big year for the world, right? Right before the world was about to come apart at its seams. Franz Boas was, and so I've stolen this from my husband, this story. I've stolen from my husband because I think it answers a lot of questions for me. Franz Boas, the founder of American anthropology, was asked a question about progress in human civilization. So American anthropology has this sort of baseline thing where we say there are no higher and lower cultures, that cultures are different, right? American anthropology it has more complicated now and sophisticated ways to talk about that, but it doesn't believe that you ascend into higher civilization. It doesn't believe that. So Franz Boas, in line with it, he said, no, there are actually no higher or lower civilizations, right? There's only one way, he said, for a civilization to progress. A society can progress in only one way. And that is by broadening the circle of people to whom you owe moral behavior, right? Mm-hmm. If you owe moral behavior, such as you consider it, moral behavior, golden rule, love one another, do unto others. If you owe moral behavior only to yourself, that's the lowest form of civilization. If you owe moral behavior further on to your family, to your friends, to your town, to your religious group, to your ethnic group, to your country, the highest form there is that you owe moral behavior, such as you understand it, to everyone. That's the highest form. If you owe moral behavior to everyone, if you have that profound acceptance, right, that all human beings in the world are equally deserving of your moral behavior, you have progressed. For me, this is a beautiful way of thinking about the tie between science and religion. This is a social scientist who came up with this, right? This idea. And it is a social idea in many ways. We all have moral behaviors all over the world. They might look a little bit different. They might sound a little bit different. But in the profoundest level, we have them. If Daniel Trocmé owes his moral behavior to everyone, in Le Chambon, they don't ask you what country you come from, and they take care of you. They owe moral behavior. This is, for me, the foundation of my faith, right? That humanity is one. We owe our love to everyone. We owe our morality to everyone. We are all part of one family. So, I mean, maybe that's a little bit abstract, but I think religion and science are both just ways of asking the questions that matter to us, right? We ask them a little bit differently. I think religion, opens up the doors of some words and it closes the doors on other words, and science does the same thing. So I think, yes, we can put them together. We just have to work at it. So
I know I can see already a couple of questions in the chat, so I will ask you my last question, but maybe we won't have time to read the last excerpt.
That's fine.
Yeah, so in your book is where I learned that you sang with the Doc Scanlon Orchestra and the famous Shoo Shoo. Yes, absolutely. And so I heard that band 35 years, maybe 25 years ago, not 35, 25 years ago at a soirée, and they're absolutely amazing. And I personally love big bands and swing, from the 1940s, because that's all my dad was listening to, because he was educated at MIT between 1945 and 1949. So I had all of Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, the Andrew's Sister by Mirwais Duchesne, and everything like that. That was what I was listening to when I was growing up. So my question for you is, how does singing fit in with the plateau?
So when I perform, I tell this story. And so when we have our next event and we're doing some music, I could tell more of it. But right when I started writing this book, really, I started the research on this book, I also auditioned for Doc Scanlon's band and got in. So I literally had a life that was Holocaust by day and sparkles and feathers by night. Literally, that was my life. And at first, you asked how they went together. They did not go together. I did not tell people. I was too embarrassed to tell people that I knew from my life of, serious life, that I did both of these things. But then, of course, these worlds started merging. But in a more serious way, I think at some point, I realized that, as you were saying, the music of my band was the soundtrack of my
Yeah.
book. Literally, this was the music that these people were listening to. And I found that these songs were teaching me a kind of an empathy with the moment. Like and you'll see in the book, there are some of these songs come through. There are a couple of songs that where the narrative is driven by these songs. So then I also realized that they were also just giving me consolation and because they're so beautiful, these songs. I learned that people were wrestling in those years with how to understand suffering, how to understand the pain of the moment, how to find kind of beauty and joy, even with all the terrible ugliness that was happening in the world. So eventually my husband got me my first ukulele, and I started on my own learning more songs, including French songs. So I started really making efforts to learn French songs from the 19 teens into the 40s as well. And what a window into that world. And then friends of mine, French friends of mine in town, they were like, inviting me over to do song nights, and so I started doing these things, and I realized that the music that I was doing on my own, the band was one thing, and then I started doing some music on my own. But I really think that we won't read this passage, but we will tell readers that there is a moment for me that really, when I encountered this angel on the elevator of the Holocaust Museum who sang a song, By Mir bist du schön, to me, a Yiddish song. Yiddish would have been the language of my ancestors. And she sang the song to me, and I learned later that she was herself an Auschwitz survivor. And that got me thinking more and more about how do you be that person who, having seen the worst in life, would still on an elevator sing to a stranger this song that means to me, By mir bist du schön, to me, you are beautiful. That's what that song means. And so for me, it was, that is what I'm doing now, mostly is music. And I find it it's a different language. It's a different language of things for me. But I think claiming beauty, claiming love, claiming kindness is a real, it's another form of resistance, it's a way that the soul can stand up and say, there is still nobility, there is still beauty, there is still song, there is still joy, even with everything crazy. So it's crazy, but it's my life. So
it's a very interesting debate, I would say, that you're talking about there, because when we think of other people who have suffered during the Holocaust and who have been like a philosopher, like Vladimir Yankelevich, for instance, who stopped speaking German at the end of the war, Vladimir Yankelevich, or if we think of the German poet Paul Celan, I can't remember the name of the poem, but I think it's Schweigen, or maybe I can't remember. But anyway, in that poem about ashes, which is I've learned it in high school in German, and then of course read it in English and then in French as well. And it's such a, I don't know how to say, like it's like if when I read it, it's like if my heart is completely taken apart by some sort of, and these are people who actually make it a point, especially Celan in his poem, of showing the hideousness of what happened because of the absence of his parents who died in the war. I mean, it's absolutely horrible. And then there is this woman at the Holocaust Museum in your book who brings back hope. So it's it's a profound philosophical debate. And that's why Melanie here has a very philosophical question for you, and I'm going to read it out loud first. But I want to say to Mark who's asked a question that I already answered in the chat. Is about, he was wondering whether the Vivarais-Lignon was the area where the Albigensian crusade against the Cathars occurred in the 210th AD, and if so, if it was something positive passed down through the centuries culture-wise from the Cathars. I will tell Mark that if he speaks French, he can attend next year in 2026 the class I will be giving on the history of the Qatar, because the Qatar is my home turf in the Toulouse region, and he can come with us to Toulouse in October if he wants, with the Alliance Française, to visit the place and the citadels of prestige, because the Qatar, there's a reality to it, and then there is a legend, and so it's a little bit different than that. Okay, so there was a huge exhibition, Mark, in that finished in January 2025, and that started in 2024 in Toulouse on 2 specific sites. Called Toulouse in the time of the Qatar. And if you have a chance to look it up, I don't know if they have anything in English, but look at Musée Saint-Raymond or Qatar exhibition in Toulouse, and you will have maybe some of the answers, and you will have actually many surprises as well. Now, Melanie wants to know more about morals, and Melanie is a student of mine as well, and she just took the class on Toulouse because she wants to come with me to the trip. So whose morals and what moral behavior? And she gives an example. People in the US in 1807 used the Bible to justify slavery. Yet James Monroe stated that God made humans. We cannot mistreat a black person. He does not argue against slavery. However, the Quakers were against slavery because they considered it was immoral. So she wants to know, when you spoke about morals and moral behavior, whose morals and what moral behavior?
Such a great question. Thank you for this question. I mean, I don't want to, it's such a large and important question. I don't want to try to minimize it by giving a pat answer. I will say that I think when we are looking for what morals really are, we have to really go deep to find those out. So that's in my view. So I would not consider anyone who read the Bible and who decided that slavery was moral was correct. You know, for me, that's not what morals are. What morals are things like, you are commanded to love one another. You are commanded to love your neighbor, right? This is a commandment. You are commanded not to judge one another. That's moral behavior, right? But and this partly comes from my own faith, the Baha'i faith. You are enjoined to have an independent investigation of truth. So I get to look at the world out there. Just because something comes from a religion doesn't mean it's moral, especially if it comes from a religion that is the institutional side of a religion. That doesn't mean it's moral. I would say that if it comes from the spiritual teachings of all the religions that I know, every single one that I've ever spent any time looking at, all of them share the deepest moral principles, I would say, which are, again, all about doing unto others and loving one another. They all have those things at their heart. Now, that is open for disagreement or discussion, and it probably should be. My definition of all that shouldn't be somebody else's definition necessarily, but I feel like, again, I'm not an expert in theology. I'm not a theologian. I'm just an innocent anthropologist or a lapsed anthropologist. But I still actually believe that the heart can recognize true things, right? And I don't think when a religion tells you to do things that are cruel, then it could possibly be the real spiritual teaching of that religion. I can't imagine a Jesus Christ that could tell us to be cruel to one another. That doesn't make sense to me. That doesn't seem like it's a moral thing to me. So we could talk about details, but it's a great question. So that was.
I think that the problem is that in 1807 they looked at the Old Testament more than at the New Testament, because if you read I'm Russian Orthodox myself. Okay, I'm not either Catholic or Protestant or Jewish, but so we look at it. And we look at it looking at the word of the gospel, you know, and I'm not either a theologian, okay, absolutely not. But the thing is, a lot of variety, I would say, of Christianity have found their ground into the Old Testament a lot more than on the New Testament. And I can see that because when I arrived in 95 in the United States, I had been here in 1979, okay, in high school in West Virginia, out of all places, during the 3 Mile Island incident. So I tell you, it was a real cultural shock for me. But the 95 when I arrived, I was so shocked. There was like these things like Unitarian Universalist, First Church of Christ, Second Church of Christ, all the way to Sixth Church of Christ, Baptist, Southern Baptist, AME, Zion, this, and I was like, what the heck is this? It's like the supermarket, you know, there's like so many different things. And even the Orthodox, as an Orthodox, I was in a state of shock also because the Greeks were there, the Ukrainian were there, the Russian there, the Ethiopian there, the Antiochian there. Was in my hometown in Toulouse, there was, maybe because we were just a little, crowd of Orthodox, there was one church and everybody was there together, the Syriac, the Greeks, the Russians, the Ukrainians, everybody was there together, and it was quite a nice mix of languages as well and of culture. So that was a little bit of a shock, but we all had this idea that, and to try and answering a little bit Melanie's question, was that, and you could not align the temporal and the spiritual together. And I remember my university professor Mourgeon, who was teaching political philosophy, he made it clear for us, and I thought like, wow, this guy is good, because obviously if you're a man of God, you don't have to answer to the immoral act of the civilian government a little bit, so in a civilian society, or the military government in a military society. And I think that has been shown at times by the South American, theology of liberation, and in other areas, those were Catholic, but in other areas it was Protestant, like the Quakers that Melanie's mentioned, who are Protestant, but they rebelled. So I think it's a question of really standing to, like you said, Maggie, to where you feel, but not only for yourself, but for the world. And so probably we need to ask ourselves in the morning, which side of history or morality do we want to stand by, the wrong or the right side of history? Yeah.
And I think back to Daniel again, who is in that moment of truth. He wasn't thinking what religion someone was. He wasn't thinking of what nation they were. He was thinking about their humanity. And I think when we do that, we're safe. We're safe, because when we assume that we have to love everybody, and what that love looks like can vary from person to person, right? But I feel like then you're safe. And, the other thing about accepting that we owe whatever that moral behavior is, that kindness, generosity, truthfulness, dignity, honor, whatever that is that we owe them, if we accept that that's the case, if I say, I accept that I owe moral behavior to everyone, people there are billions of people that I don't know and I can't see, but I still, in theory, owe them all moral behavior. But then it just becomes work to figure out, okay, so how do I figure that out? How do I, as a person, how do I, as a community, how do I figure, as a country, how do we figure out how to make that happen? But you don't have to be confused. You don't have to think, I'm supposed to love these people, I am supposed to hate these people. You don't have to be confused. I don't have to be confused. I just think, no, I have to love everybody. And then smart people in various ways have to help me know how I can do that, in my own life, right here, right now. These refugees, Le Chambon right now, again, there are people they're finding their way there. It's crazy. And right now, they get their stuff together, they find them lodging, they teach them French, they get them, I mean, it's possible. There's so much that we can do. It's so much hope because there are people like that in the world. And I think everybody has a little bit of that in them too. We all do. So.
Yeah, and Le Chambon-sur-Lignon was nominated as the righteous region for chez les Justes in Israel, in Yad Vashem. So if you ever visit the place, it's there as well. So that's quite an exemplary thing. Has anyone got a question that you haven't written in the chat? And in which case, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Everybody's shy.
Yeah, don't be shy. You can ask a question. We have a couple of more minutes before we finish the event.
We can ask people if they like singing because the next event will be singing along. So there's that.
Right. Yes. So if you want to join and listen to Maggie sing, and weave some more stories about the plateau and that period, you can come to the Alliance on Friday, May 16th. We will be very happy to have Maggie in person, and she'll be singing songs from the interwar at the end of the 1919, which is the Traité de Versailles, basically, all the way to the 1939 and beyond during the war as well. And so we can't wait to have you in person, Maggie. And you could definitely, if you have the book, please bring it, because I'm sure she will be delighted to sign it for you as well. So you can do that as well on that event on Friday, May the 16th. And you will be receiving, once we have edited it, you will be receiving a link to our YouTube channel if you want to share that video to somebody, or if you want to watch it again. But give us a bit of time, because tomorrow is yes. Thank you, Catherine, for putting it in the chat, and the event for the next event with Maggie. But give us a bit of time, and we will send you the link probably in the middle of next week. Voila. And Maggie, thank you very much for accepting to answer all my questions and for the wonderful conversation. It was an honor and a pleasure.
It was my honor, and thank you. Thank you to all the folks out there who are still there. The ones that I know, I give you kisses. The ones who I don't know, I give you kisses. Thank you for coming, and please do come to the music event. I think we'll have some fun. It'll be great.
Yeah. Thank you to all, and to all who have listened from afar or from close by. Please, it was a pleasure to have you all. Thank you. Take care. Bye.